The twilight of May 24, 1945 settled over the Ryukyu Islands with a deceptive calm as the humid air hung heavy with the smell of pulverized coral and high-test aviation fuel. Yantan Airfield, located on the western coast of Okinawa, had become one of the most critical logistical and tactical hubs in the Pacific Theater. Captured in the opening days of the amphibious invasion, the airfield was a sprawling expanse of crushed coral runways, taxiways and revetments hacked out of the Okinawan landscape by the naval construction battalions. It was the absolute nerve center for American air superiority over the island, housing elements of the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing and the Army Air Forces. The flight line was an immense parking lot of lethality-crowded wingtip to wingtip with Vought F-4U Corsairs, Grumman TBF Avengers, Consolidated PB-4Y Privateers and Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft. For the aviation mechanics, ordnance men, armorers and logistical clerks stationed at Yantan, the war was a grueling industrial reality defined by grease, hydraulic fluid and the relentless roar of Pratt & Whitney radial engines. These men were technically rear-echelon support personnel, but on Okinawa the concept of a secure rear area was an absolute illusion. The Japanese 32nd Army, deeply entrenched in the Shuri Line to the south, subjected the airfield to constant long-range artillery harassment and nightly air raids that forced the mechanics to dive into muddy slit trenches, leaving their tools and half-repaired aircraft on the tarmac. But nothing in their training or their grueling daily routine could have prepared them for the unprecedented and terrifying form of assault that was currently accelerating toward them through the dark skies north of the island. High above the East China Sea, an entirely new and desperate tactical doctrine of the Japanese Empire was in motion. The Japanese High Command, realizing that conventional air attacks were failing to halt the American mechanical juggernaut, had authorized Operation GI Go, an airborne commando raid of suicidal audacity. The objective was to physically land highly trained saboteurs directly onto the American runways at Yantan and Kadena to destroy as many parked aircraft as possible, to ignite the massive fuel dumps, and to disrupt the constant aerial bombardment of the Japanese home islands. The unit selected for this mission was the Giretsu Kutetai, a specially formed airborne raiding force commanded by Captain Michiro Okayama. Okayama and his men were not conventional infantry, they were specialized saboteurs trained extensively in night operations, demolitions and close-quarters combat. They were armed specifically for the destruction of parked aircraft carrying Type 99 magnetic mines, heavy pole charges designed to be slammed into airplane wings, and Type 100 submachine guns, a rare weapon in the Japanese arsenal chosen specifically for its close-range volume of fire. They carried no rations and no heavy medical supplies because extraction was never planned. It was a one-way mission and acceptance of absolute annihilation in exchange for maximum mechanical destruction. The delivery system for this assault was a squadron of Mitsubishi Ki-21 twin-engine heavy bombers known to the Allies by the reporting name Sally. The Ki-21 was largely obsolete by 1945, too slow and poorly armed to survive in contested airspace. For this mission, the aircraft of the 3rd Independent Flying Squadron had been heavily modified. The defensive gun turrets were stripped out to reduce weight and save fuel. They were painted in a stark dark green camouflage with the identifying roundels obscured to blend into the night sky. On the evening of May 24, 12 of these stripped-down bombers, heavily laden with explosives and carrying 14 commandos each, took off from Kengan Airfield in Kumamoto Prefecture, Japan. The flight south was plagued by mechanical failures and the deteriorating reality of Japanese aviation logistics. 4 of the 12 bombers experienced severe engine trouble and were forced to turn back shortly after takeoff. The remaining 8 aircraft pushed forward, flying low over the ocean to evade early warning radar, maintaining complete radio silence as they navigated toward the massive American armada surrounding Okinawa. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, the air raid sirens at Yantan Airfield began their familiar rising wail. American radar operators utilizing the advanced SCR-270 sets had detected incoming bogies approaching from the north. The mechanics working under the glare of floodlights on the flight lines immediately cut the power, plunging the sprawling airfield into darkness. They dropped their wrenches and grease guns and scrambled into the protective sandbag dugouts lining the taxiways. The anti-aircraft defense network surrounding Yantan was arguably one of the most concentrated and lethal in the world. It consisted of radar-guided 90mm heavy anti-aircraft guns positioned on the high ground, capable of throwing high-explosive fragmentation shells miles into the sky. Closer to the runways, batteries of 40mm Bofors automatic cannons and 50 caliber water-cooled Browning machine guns on quad mounts stood ready to create a localized wall of steel. As the drone of the Japanese radial engines became audible over the ocean, the American gunners acquired their targets. The night sky suddenly erupted in a blinding, chaotic crosshatch of tracer fire. The engagement was spectacularly violent. American night fighter aircraft F-6F Hellcats equipped with airborne intercept radar were already prowling the darkness and engaged the slow-moving bombers. The heavy 90mm batteries tore into the Japanese formation. From the slit trenches, the mechanics watched as the sky filled with the terrifying geometry of anti-aircraft fire. One by one, the Ki-21 bombers were struck. They blossomed into massive orange fireballs plunging from the sky to crash into the ocean or shatter against the coral ridges surrounding the airfield. To the ground crews huddled in the dirt, it appeared to be a successful defensive action, another failed Japanese air raid neutralized by overwhelming American firepower. But the anti-aircraft gunners, relying heavily on their optics and radar in the chaotic airspace, failed to track one single low-flying bomber that had successfully slipped through the defensive gauntlet. The surviving Ki-21, piloted by a desperate and highly skilled aviator, utilized the undulating terrain of Okinawa to mask his approach. He dropped the bomber dangerously close to the ground, skimming over the jagged coral ridges and bypassing the heavy gun batteries. With his landing gear retracted to prevent flipping upon impact, the pilot aimed the massive twin-engine aircraft directly at the main north-south runway of Yontan Airfield. At exactly 10:30 in the evening, the bomber slammed onto the crushed coral. The kinetic energy of the crash landing was catastrophic. The aluminum belly of the aircraft screamed against the jagged rock, throwing up a massive blinding shower of sparks that illuminated the entire flight line. The propellers struck the runway, shattering into lethal metal shrapnel that tore through the air. The fuselage groaned and buckled, but the structural integrity held just long enough. The bomber skidded for hundreds of yards, leaving a deep gouge in the coral before violently spinning and coming to a halt directly in the middle of the parking revetments where the American aircraft were tied down for the night. Before the dust and smoke of the crash had even settled, the heavily modified fuselage doors of the Ki-21 were kicked open. The surviving members of the Giretsu Kudettai, perhaps a dozen men, poured out of the shattered bomber and sprinted directly into the American flight line. They did not attempt to establish a defensive perimeter or engage the anti-aircraft crews. Their sole fanatical focus was the destruction of the aircraft surrounding them. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, executing the demolition tactics they had rehearsed for months. They utilized small explosive charges fixed to the ends of long bamboo poles, slamming them into the delicate aluminum wings and fuel tanks of the parked corsairs and privateers. They threw white phosphorus grenades into the open hatches of the C-47 transport planes. The phosphorus ignited instantly, burning at over 5,000 degrees, generating thick, blinding white smoke and melting through the aircraft fuselages like a blowtorch through wax. Within seconds, Yontan Airfield was transformed into an apocalyptic landscape. A massive consolidated PB-4Y privateer A4-engine heavy patrol bomber, fully loaded with thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and internal ammunition magazines, was struck by a pole charge. The resulting explosion was colossal, sending a shockwave across the airfield that knocked men flat in their trenches. The burning fuel cascaded outward, creating a river of fire that flowed across the coral, igniting adjacent aircraft. A string of Vought F-4U Corsairs, their distinctive gull wings catching the light of the flames, began to detonate as the fire reached their internal fuel cells, and the 50 caliber ammunition stored in their wings began to cook off, firing randomly across the tarmac. The heat became absolutely unbearable, radiating outward and turning the humid night air into a suffocating furnace. The massive fuel dumps located near the edge of the runway, containing over 70,000 gallons of highly volatile high-test aviation gasoline, were breached and ignited, sending a column of black smoke and rolling flames hundreds of feet into the night sky, turning the darkness into a brilliant, terrifying artificial noon. For the American aviation mechanics, armorers, and logistical personnel hiding in the slit trenches, the reality of the situation rapidly shifted from an aerial bombardment to a terrifying ground assault. They were not infantrymen. Their daily lives were consumed by torque wrenches, spark plugs, and hydraulic lines, not close-quarters combat. But as they watched the Japanese commandos running through the flames, systematically destroying their aircraft, the primal instinct for survival and defense took over. There was no time to wait for the military police or the heavily armed Marine infantry battalions stationed miles away. The perimeter had been breached from the inside out and the enemy was standing on their flight line. The mechanics scrambled out of the dirt and ran toward their tents and the base armories. They smashed open wooden crates and kicked down doors, desperately grabbing any weapon they could find. They armed themselves with standard-issue M1 Garand rifles, lightweight M1 carbines, Thompson submachine guns, and .45 caliber 1911 pistols. Many of these men had not fired a weapon since their basic training in the United States, but the desperate reality of the burning airfield stripped away their rear echelon status instantly. Every man with a wrench suddenly became a rifleman. The firefight that erupted across Yontan airfield was chaotic, decentralized, and deeply confusing. The illumination provided by the burning aircraft cast long, terrifying shadows across the tarmac, making it incredibly difficult to distinguish friend from foe. The Japanese commandos, highly trained in night infiltration, utilized the shadows and the thick black smoke to their advantage. They moved rapidly between the burning planes, firing short controlled bursts from their Type 100 submachine guns and throwing fragmentation grenades at any group of Americans attempting to organize a defense. The mechanics formed ad hoc fire teams, taking cover behind the massive tires of the transport planes and the sandbag walls of the revetments. They fired blindly into the smoke, aiming at the muzzle flashes of the Japanese weapons. The noise was absolutely deafening, a cacophony of exploding aircraft cooking off ammunition, the heavy thud of the 90mm guns still firing blindly into the sky, the sharp crack of the M1 Garands, and the rapid stutter of the Japanese submachine guns. A group of Marine aviation mechanics from the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing, utilizing a pair of jeeps, attempted to outflank the commandos near the center of the runway. They mounted .30 caliber light machine guns on the hoods of the vehicles and drove directly into the intense heat of the burning privateers, providing a base of suppressing fire. The commandos, realizing they were being cornered, did not retreat or attempt to surrender. Surrender was entirely outside the parameters of the Giretsu philosophy. When they exhausted their explosive charges and their submachine gun ammunition ran dry, they drew their officers' swords or fixed bayonets and charged directly at the American positions, attempting to inflict fatal casualties in close quarters hand-to-hand combat before being cut down by the overwhelming volume of American rifle fire. The mechanics, untrained in infantry tactics, relied on sheer volume of fire to survive, emptying their magazines into the shadows until the rifles were smoking hot. The engagement lasted for several agonizing hours. The surviving commandos scattered across the massive airfield, forcing the mechanics and the quickly organizing military police units to hunt them down one by one in the dark. The Americans had to move meticulously, checking every shadow under the wings of the surviving aircraft, clearing the drainage ditches and the maintenance sheds. It was a terrifying game of hide and seek played out in a landscape of burning metal and exploding ordnance. By the early hours of the morning, the gunfire slowly began to subside, replaced by the roar of the massive fires consuming the aircraft and the fuel dumps. The American firefighting crews, driving their heavy foam trucks, braved the lingering threat of sniper fire and cooking off ammunition to battle the inferno, desperately trying to prevent the fire from spreading to the intact squadrons of fighter planes necessary for the defense of the island the next day. When the sun finally rose over Okinawa on the morning of May 25, the true extent of the devastation at Yontan airfield became agonizingly clear. The flight line resembled a twisted, blackened graveyard of modern military aviation. The hulking remains of 9 major American aircraft, including 3 4-engine heavy bombers, 2 Corsairs, and several transport planes, had been completely reduced to melted aluminum and charred engines. 29 other aircraft had sustained severe damage from shrapnel explosives or the intense radiating heat. Over 70,000 gallons of irreplaceable aviation fuel had been completely consumed. The physical damage to the logistical infrastructure was staggering, representing a massive localized victory for the single surviving Japanese bomber crew. The mechanics walked through the smoking wreckage, their utility uniforms coated in soot and coral dust, staring in disbelief at the destruction of the machines they had spent thousands of hours meticulously maintaining. The human cost was equally sobering. 2 American personnel had been killed in the chaotic crossfire and 18 others had sustained wounds from shrapnel and gunshot injuries. But scattered across the pulverized coral of the runway and hidden within the shadows of the revetments lay the bodies of the Japanese commandos. Every single member of the Giretsu force that had landed on the airfield had been killed. They lay where they had fallen, gripping their weapons, their bodies torn apart by the concentrated fire of the aviation mechanics. When the American intelligence officers examined the bodies, they found the commandos dressed in specialized camouflage uniforms equipped with high-quality compasses, detailed maps of the airfield, and carrying heavy demolition charges perfectly designed for their specific destructive task. The intelligence analysis revealed the terrifying reality of the Giretsu kudettai. These were not desperate conscripts fighting blindly, they were highly disciplined specialized troops executing a perfectly planned asymmetrical strike designed to maximize chaos and material destruction. The psychological impact of the Giretsu raid on the American forces on Okinawa was profound. The attack completely shattered the illusion of a safe rear echelon area. The mechanics, clerks, and cooks realized that they were just as vulnerable to the absolute violence of the Pacific War as the infantrymen fighting in the mud of the Shuri Line miles to the south. The Japanese had proven their capability and their willingness to bypass the massive American naval blockade and strike directly at the heart of the logistical network. In response to the raid, the base defense protocols at Yontan and every other airfield on the island were completely overhauled. Perimeter security was drastically increased, heavily armed infantry patrols were established within the flight lines, and the aviation mechanics were ordered to keep their loaded rifles immediately accessible at all times while performing maintenance on the aircraft. The raid demonstrated the lengths to which the Japanese Empire would go to bleed the American forces, a fanatical commitment to utilizing suicidal tactics not just in the air with the kamikaze but on the ground with highly trained infiltration units. The historical significance of this specific event lies in its stark, brutal illustration of the realities of total war. The Battle for Okinawa was a campaign of unprecedented violence characterized by massive naval bombardments, grinding infantry assaults, and the terrifying implementation of the kamikaze strategy. But the Giretsu raid on Yontan Airfield represents a unique micro-narrative within the larger conflict. It is a story of mechanical ingenuity, desperate courage, and absolute fanaticism. It forces a re-evaluation of the traditional roles assigned to military personnel. In the desperate hours of May 24, the rigid delineations between the combat infantryman and the logistical support technician entirely dissolved. The survival of the most critical airfield in the Pacific Theater did not rely on the armor of tanks or the heavy artillery of the fleet, but on the immediate violent reaction of young men who dropped their tools, picked up rifles, and engaged in a savage close-quarters battle against an elite enemy strike force. The details of the engagement, the specific modifications to the Ki-21 bombers, the chemical composition of the white phosphorus grenades, the precise actions of the mechanics firing M1 carbines from behind the landing gear of PB-4Y privateers are not mere footnotes in the historical record. They are the essential verifiable facts that ground the narrative in the unyielding reality of the era. To understand the profound nature of the Pacific conflict, one must understand the absolute tactical desperation that drives a military force to crash a bomber into an enemy runway and deploy saboteurs with magnetic mines. One must understand the terrifying suddenness with which a mundane maintenance operation is transformed into a fight for survival. The unvarnished truth of the Giretsu raid requires no dramatization because the verified historical parameters are inherently cinematic and utterly devastating. The mechanics of Yontan Airfield, who successfully defended their flight line against the elite airborne commandos, proved that in the brutal mathematics of the Second World War, every man standing on the battlefield, regardless of his primary occupational specialty, was ultimately an infantryman whose life depended entirely on his ability to point a rifle into the dark and pull the trigger.